Well, thank you very much, Sadia and Dimitri, Irene, of course, for inviting me and organizing this really wonderful event. So I thought I'd begin by saying that I have never quite believed in Edward Said's argument in Orientalism that there is a one-to-one relationship between the Orient construed as Islamic and Europe or the West that is mutually constitutive for several reasons. One, because I think that this relationship is not a continuous one but a discontinuous one. And secondly, because he really cannot substantiate his argument on the basis of the fact that he falsely uses a kind of Foucauldian term, discourse, which suggests the making of discipline and regulation for a field Orientalism which has never been so defined, which has always been undisciplined and relatively unregulated. So what I'd like to do then is to think about today how it is in the 21st century that a new kind of relationship is created, but also uncreated on the basis of sovereignty, right? So, as we know, our times are times where there seems to be a great deal of anxiety about sovereignty, the sovereignty that everyone seems to be in fear of losing. In America, in Europe, in other parts of the world, in India, in Brazil, in Russia, etc. In Europe, of course, this fear of the loss of sovereignty precedes the financial crisis and probably results from the construction of the European Union itself. Because here is a body that, while being indubitably political, seems to possess no sovereignty. It has no sovereign center. If anything, its sovereignty is vested in NATO and therefore exercised by non-European powers. And I suppose partly as a response to this interesting conundrum of having a polity of some sort without any sovereign element to it, Islam seems to have become the major way of thinking about this, if you will, dereliction of sovereignty. And this is an argument made quite briefly by Olivier Roy, who points out that it's not actually things like immigration, hijabs, crime in the Parisian banlieue, etc. It's not these sociological factors that make for a certain kind of debate about Islam. It's the fact that Islam signals and rehearses this anxiety about the absence of sovereignty in this new space, or the suppression of former European national sovereignties to this larger form, the Union. And you can see why that might be the case, because like Europe in the Union, Islam too claims to be a transnational body with no center and with no sovereign form. And in a way, but only in a way, militant Islam seeks to reproduce a kind of sovereignty that doesn't exist. And therefore, it's not accidental that you see figures like Michel Houellebecq, the famous French writer, who in his novel Soumission, Submission, imagines a France that is taken over by its Muslim population by way of stealth. That the French are simply too good-natured and tolerant and liberal, and therefore have been disabled from combating this menace. But it goes further than this. Islam doesn't simply represent a menace. It represents the very virility and masculinity of sovereign force that Europe seems to have lost or abdicated. And therefore, the French have to learn from the Muslims how to reclaim their own sovereignty, or rather, the Muslims have taken over from the French. And of course, this is a rehearsing of colonial trope, because this kind of argument had once been made in the 19th and early 20th centuries by colonized populations in an apologetic mode, where people would say, well, look, we have lost to the British or the French or whoever because we have become weak. And they have, in fact, taken over our mission. This is particularly true for Muslim populations in places like South Asia, where so-called Muslim modernists made this argument. After all, Europe is only an extension and expansion of Islam. So in becoming Europeanized, we are simply recovering our own past. The fact that the French are doing this, or Ulebek is doing this, of course, in a way suggests his inability to come to terms with France's own colonial history. So that by way of preamble. So I wanted to begin with the anxiety around sovereignty to make an argument for a different kind of anxiety around sovereignty with radical Islam. Right? And to point out that a lot of anti-colonial movements by the middle of the 20th century were actually critical of both the nation state as a form and its ideal of sovereignty. So there the anxiety comes from a different direction. How not to become sovereign? How can you remain without sovereignty and yet be free? Now this is something that Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, is very keen on. He doesn't like the idea of the state. He wants a minimum state, if a state at all. He calls himself a philosophical anarchist. He thinks that society can and should run itself. He rejects the model of a pyramid with the sovereign peak for what he calls an oceanic wave, where you just move outwards. The wave move outward. One village to a group of villages to a district, etc., etc. So if sovereignty exists, it exists only it is fragmented, dispersed, and exists only at the level of the individual in reality. So the problem for people like Gandhi is, how can you become free without sovereignty? And it remains a problem because, of course, Gandhi and others like him, and I'll come to them soon, understand very well that the process of colonization involves the exercise of sovereignty, and to reclaim sovereignty is only to repeat in your own name the colonial gesture that a European power might have exercised before. Which is why, unlike Nehru, who says there are two Englands, there's the England of John Stuart Mill and liberty, and then there's the England of colonial oppression, Gandhi says, no, there's only one England. The England of John Stuart Mill depends upon the England of colonial oppression, and vice versa, that you cannot separate them. So you must try to think about a future in freedom without the state and its sovereign form. So what I want to argue today is that a number of Muslim thinkers in this period, and I'm going to focus initially on Maududi, Abul Ala Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat-e-Islami, and arguably the most important Islamist, as they are now called. Once upon a time, we used to call them fundamentalist thinkers in the world. So his ideas are influential on Khomeini and in Iran, and on Sayyid Qutb in Egypt, and much further afield, though he himself never achieves state power. So Maududi, in his early career, is part of the circle around Gandhi, on whom he writes an adulatory biography, which is so adulatory that it ceased in press by the British and destroyed. And he gets a number of his categories, I strongly suspect, from a kind of Gandhian milieu, though of course he's not dedicated to nonviolence. And among these ideas has to do his deep suspicion of the state and of sovereignty. His theory that Islamic society must manage itself through the figure of Islamic law, which for him is not a sovereign figure. The Islamic law is important for Maududi precisely because it is archaic. It comes from the past, and therefore it cannot, in his view, have any meaning in terms of interest. I happen not to think he's correct on this, but this seems to be his argument. That precisely because it is archaic, it is full of things that appear to make no sense for modern times, that it cannot be claimed by any particular class or group of people. It is resistant to the logic of interest. It is neutral, if you will. And it is to be managed from outside the state. So the authorities who determine the interpretation of the Sharia are not to be located within the precincts of the state. They are to be located in society. Sharia serves as a kind of second nature, whereas Gandhi had looked at, if you will, social reality, castes, villages, communities, individuals, as the site for the exercise of freedom. Maududi, who's not so trustful of society, wants to actually replace it with this second nature, Sharia as Muslim society, outside the state. And when I say outside the state, I mean something very specific, because Maududi is possibly the earliest modern Muslim thinker who deliberately seeks to expel sovereignty, which he does by attributing it to God. Sovereignty belongs to God. He has a fascinating argument which he develops not out of any Muslim tradition, but by reference to Thomas Hobbes and Jean Baudin, etc. He has no tradition really to rely upon, because one of the other points I want to make, which I won't explore here, is how so much of modern Islamic thought rejects its own past and doesn't really have, it doesn't reject the theological past, but it rejects the political past, with some exceptions, Iran and Turkey perhaps being among them. And therefore it doesn't have political resources. It hardly has a political vocabulary to call its own. It must go by way of the West, as Maududi does explicitly. So you would think he would have benefited from reading Schmitt, or maybe not, because he makes a kind of strangely Schmittian argument, though against Schmitt. This is what he says. He says, look, sovereignty in the way it is defined by Hobbes and Baudin and others, he also cites Blackstone's commentaries, is a notion that is so absolute that it cannot possibly be real. That is to say, it cannot possibly be exercised by human agency. It must therefore belong to God. It is a theological concept. In that sense, he's making a Schmittian argument. The argument that all secular concepts come from, or many apparently secular political categories come out of the theological world. But he does something different. He says, it is not that in pre-modern times, the Muslim authorities actually exercised such sovereignty. They could not, because it belonged to God. It is only under secular conditions that the theological becomes manifest. The religious people it would be an impertinence and a blasphemy and a sacrilege to actually exercise sovereignty, because how could you? Only God can exercise it. And God is, as it were, removed from the picture. So by literally expelling sovereignty, attributing it to God, what he's trying to do is to make for an Islamic society that runs itself through the process of law, which is given to you already, which requires only tinkering, and whose authorities, as I said, are placed outside the state itself. Right? And the reason he does this is actually fascinating, and it's also kind of interestingly engaged with, or would have been engaged with, Schmitt, had he known Schmitt's writing. So he said the problem with sovereignty in its modern form is that no one can ever match up to it, because it is so theological, because it is so pure and so absolute a notion. No king or parliament or president can possibly match up to the concept of sovereignty. that we might think that the American president has sovereign power insofar as he's allowed to press that famous red button and launch a nuclear arsenal. But in fact, he cannot do so. So we hope. It's an impossibility. And it's in the gap between the absolute notion of sovereignty and its reality that oppression and tyranny enter the world. Precisely because sovereignty cannot be manifested, cannot be instantiated, since only God can manifest it. In other words, his argument against tyranny is not that it proceeds from an excess of power, but rather from an absence of power, of real power. Had anyone been in possession of this kind of power, you wouldn't require that kind of force. But it's precisely because there is that gap that sovereignty can never be manifested in reality that you have tyranny and despotism emerge in the world. Therefore, he wants to expel it. Right? He wants to think about, in a different way from Gandhi, a society that runs itself. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that sovereignty keeps returning in a ghostly form, that he can't really keep it away. It's an interesting fact that the very unreality of sovereignty transforms it into a specter that comes back to haunt Maududi's enterprise. And I would like to suggest that the Pakistani constitution, of which there have been 3 iterations so far, and which was given its preamble largely through Maududi's petitioning and objections and protests and demonstrations outside the Constituent Assembly, enacts this spectral haunting of the sovereign. So one of the things Maududi's protests, he gathers all the Islamic religious leaders behind him, and they demand that sovereignty cannot possibly belong either to the state or the people of Pakistan. It must be attributed to God. If I'm not mistaken, this is the first constitution in which sovereignty is actually resigned. Right? It's given over to God. Afterwards, Iran, etc., adopt that as well. So once you refuse to institutionalize sovereignty, I think, because in other respects, Pakistan is a modern state. It needs to be exercised in some fashion. It comes back in the form of the coup d'etat, right? Which is the, if you will, Schmittian miracle. It really is that moment of exception, but it's an exception that often lasts many, many years, if not decades. And that's one way in which the figure of sovereignty reappears in ghostly fashion in Pakistani politics through the coup. The first coup was an executive coup. It was not a military coup. It was a coup by the Governor General. And subsequently, there have been judicial and military coups. That the military coup allows for the spectral exercise of sovereignty in a situation where sovereignty cannot be institutionalized. It has no institutional position. So even as a myth, it has, as myths always do, it has effect. Right? So now Maududi, like Gandhi, takes both from an anarchist in the case of Gandhi and a Bolshevik in the case of Maududi history. A former president of the Muslim League once asked Gandhi what he thought of Lenin, and Gandhi's response was, "I would begin where Lenin ends," which is to say, the withering away of the state. Lenin builds his whole theory only to end with that, but I, Gandhi said, would cut to the chase. You just begin with the withering away of the state. Why would you just end there, right? Maududi is much more Bolshevik. He wants the dictatorship of the proletariat, by which, of course, he doesn't mean the proletariat, the dictatorship of the Islamists, who capture the state only to seek to roll it back and to abolish it. Right? So in both cases, you have the withering away of the state as being the telos of this project, one anarchist and the other Bolshevik. Right? Now, during the Cold War, these ways of thinking critically about sovereignty the Gandhian non-violent way and the Maududian often violent way, with their respective links to anarchism and Bolshevism, were manageable because they were confined to the carapace of the state, which was and in many ways continues to be, the singular unit of political life around the globe. But after the Cold War, with the making of a new kind of global arena, and the transnational flow of capital, populations, etc., stymied here and there and allowed in others, you have the emergence of new forms for which the state is no longer crucial. So Maududi was content, like Gandhi, to confine himself to a state with the intention of rolling it back in some fashion. Right? But you needed it just as Lenin needed the dictatorship of the proletariat. Not because the state was a wonderful thing, but because it needed to be captured in order to be destroyed. But in the post-Cold War world, you have emerging these new movements, and I'm going to focus on Al-Qaeda and ISIS, to show how they take the Gandhi/Maududi objective, which is a critique of sovereignty, and seek to prevent its ghostly recurrence. So with Al-Qaeda, of course, you have a situation where truly a global movement, there is no desire to set up a state. People are drawn from all over the world. And also the refusal even to claim sovereign status, because of course sovereignty can only belong to God, and to claim sovereign power in any way would be to flout the divine decree. And so in a kind of cliched way, and the whole movement operates as a set of cliches, how this works. The argument is the following. We kill your women, children, innocents because you kill ours. We do this because you do that. That Al-Qaeda simply, it claims no ontological integrity of its own. It is a purely negative form. It simply holds the mirror up to its enemy. It is made possible by its enemy. It is almost as if it's the refusal to claim responsibility, which is what this kind of logic entails, happens by a displacement, right? So we, in fact, are not killing anyone. We are simply the response of your killing. We are simply the mirror to your killing. Now, this is not obviously a legalistic way of disclaiming responsibility, because otherwise they would not, as it would be visible. You wouldn't have videotapes and things like that. So this is not this kind of idea that were we to be taken to a court of law, we would say, no, this is not about that at all. Right? It's a much more deeply existential, indeed philosophical gesture of disclaiming, right? Disavowing, I would say, right? Because they're constantly faced with this problem of how can we act without somehow becoming sovereign. One way of doing so is to literally become a negative figure, a mirror. Now, despite this, there is a kind of ghost internationalism as well that's there. So the references to sovereign states don't cease exactly, even though Al-Qaeda never claims to be one. But its militants are given the name of states, very interestingly. So you can be called Al-Amriki, the American, or Al-Britanni, the Britisher, if you join up from any of these countries. So there's a way in which, bizarrely, the nation state of sovereign hue makes its spectral reappearance in the world of Al-Qaeda and later in that of ISIS as well. But in every other way, we are talking about, if you will, a negative ontology and processes of mirroring in all kinds of ways. This also means that the relationship between Al-Qaeda and its Western enemy is of the most intimate kind, which I think is why you never hear anyone from the late Al-Qaeda speaking of their enemies in anything but joking, jocular, and intimate ways. There is no conception of the alienness and foreignness of the enemy, which we normally attribute to enmity. The contrary, of course, is true of the so-called West, where Al-Qaeda has to be seen as alien, foreign, utterly incomprehensible. Why do they hate us, etc. Bin Laden and Zawahiri's commentaries on the West have always been of a joking kind. We know exactly what you're like. We know all about you. We even understand you. Right? And I think this is possible because there's almost no distance between the two, because Al-Qaeda is simply the negative image of its enemy. And I think this is also why its chief or iconic figure, the suicide bomber, is such a negative one. Not simply because he must die in order to kill, or kill in order to die, but also because the cliche of the suicide bomber is exchanging death for life. Both, of course, are forms of sovereign action. Taking life and giving death. In this case, it is almost as if the suicide bomber, as Al-Qaeda's iconic figure, and they would release these martyrdom videotapes, becomes, if you will, or can only manifest a pseudo-sovereign identity posthumously. These are posthumous figures. By the time you get to know them, by the time you see them, they're already dead. They're no longer living. So there's a whole logics of negativity that runs through the language of Al-Qaeda, which I would like to suggest has to do with this attempt to exorcise the possibility of sovereign power, which is sacrilegious and blasphemous, but not simply in this theological manner, and precisely because the aim is to think about a stateless society, think about a society that runs itself, in their case, through the figure of Sharia. Right. Now, I want to move to ISIS and then close. Now, what we see, of course, with ISIS is that it emerges after the global war on terror. One of the things the war on terror does is to territorialize the battle, whether deliberately or not. So Al-Qaeda was a globalized phenomenon. It was here and there. Even before Afghanistan, Bin Laden was in Sudan, etc. Right? They experiment all over the world. What the war on terror does is localize the battle in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. And in both places, it produces new kinds of movements. The return of the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the making of all kinds of militias in Iraq and later in Syria. But among them is something that comes to be called the Islamic State, which, unlike Al-Qaeda, claims a territory, though it is a fluctuating territory. Its borders are never given, they're expanding and shrinking all the time. But it claims the mantle of the state. It calls itself a state, a dawla. Right? And it experiments with all kinds of state-like signs of sovereignty, but they're all illusory. So coinage, there's a brief period in which there's a minting of gold coins, supposedly to avoid or avert or circumvent the capitalist economy, though how this is done is not clear. The coins are not used. They're not there to be used. They're a kind of gesture of some kind of dead sovereignty, pre-modern sovereignty. Kings used to stamp their countenance upon these coins, and that's how you could tell that the state existed. And there are other forms as well, which Al-Qaeda militants also profess. So not just the naming in terms of the nation state, but also the kind of taking up of different kinds of garments, a hodgepodge of styles, from the Kalashnikov of a previous era of terrorism, even before the Islamic version, to things that come from various fronts of battle, Afghan caps, something from Syria, something from here, something from there, a more recognizable military fatigue type stuff. So there's a kind of mishmash of things, some of which have a kind of sovereign genealogy and others of which don't. But and of course, the making of the caliphate, the idea of the caliph, which is resurrected for the first time since 1924 when it had been abolished by Ataturk. And it's interesting that Al-Qaeda never claimed the caliphate. They called the Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban in Afghanistan, Amir al-Mu'mineen, the Prince of Believers, which is a title customarily given to a caliph, but it doesn't have to be a caliphal title, and they never went that step further, nor did Mullah Omar to claim to be a caliph. So you have this kind of ghostly return of the state and its form of sovereignty. But what's interesting here is that it is no longer in a relationship of mirroring a negative ontology with the West. The West is no longer the enemy even for ISIS. It is that place where you conduct your spectacular operations. It is a site for recruitment, and it is an arena for your public relations. There is not nearly as much verbiage about the West as there was with Al-Qaeda, where the West is constantly being addressed, directly being addressed. Here you have very little. Occasionally, of course, you have it. You need it, but the enemy has changed. The enemy is now internal in two senses. It's internal because sovereignty now lurks in the inner lives of all Muslims, potentially. It's not only to be found outside. And it's internal in another sense because the chief representative of this hidden form of sovereignty is the Shia. So it's a strongly, as we know, a strongly sectarian phenomenon. Anti-Western battle has been replaced by internal Muslim battle. The Shia are not simply the Shia. They're not attacked only for themselves. They serve as representatives of this form of sovereignty, which has, as it were, retreated into its kind of inner lair. What you need to do is root it out because anyone could have it somehow hiding in there. They might think of themselves as sovereign. So the process of mirroring changes. There is some mirroring of the old-fashioned kind, but it's truncated. So you'll recall when Jim Foley was captured and beheaded by a set of clever camera angles and all the rest. There is some mirroring. He's dressed in these Guantanamo Bay style orange type jumpsuits, right? He's waterboarded for no particular reason, but because people are waterboarded at Guantanamo. But that's it. You have these other situations in which a Jordanian pilot who had been shot down is burnt alive in a cage. There, it's a curious kind of enaction of what would have happened to him had he really gone down with his plane. He would also have been burnt alive in a metal cage, which is what his plane would have become, his fighter jet. So it's a kind of enactment of something that might have befallen him had he not been, if you will, rescued or whatever. So you have these kinds of different forms of mimicry, mirroring what you have, but they're truncated in all kinds of ways because the relationship here is not with the West. There are forms of metaphorical thinking which bear commentary, but I'll leave those aside for the moment. What I want to suggest is through the Shia, sovereignty is disavowed. Right? How is this done? So there's another form of mirroring that occurs. Here, the idea of the caliph, the caliphate, and of the companions of the Prophet, the Sahaba, become crucial as if you will, mirror images of the supreme leader of the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and the sinless imams of the Shiites. Right? And we know this happens well before ISIS. So after the Iranian Revolution, which was welcomed very often by Sunni Islamists in its early years, you then have a kind of reaction to it, but in a curious way, where you need to actually repeat the ritual and other categories of your enemy. So if the Iranians have their supreme leader, Khomeini and later Khamenei, then you must have your Caliph. So the figure of the Caliphate rises again in this period, post-Iranian Revolution. Right? If the Shiites have their 12 sinless imams, then we must privilege the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, whom the Shiites execrate for the most part, just as they execrate the Sunni caliphs. Right? So there you have another kind of thing happening, which happens in the years after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, 1979, but only comes, as it were, to its sort of violent denouement with ISIS. Right? So these things are somewhat familiar, and these processes begin mostly in Pakistan, right, in the 80s and 90s. And I'm coming to a close. Now, the Shiite veneration of the supreme leader and the imams, of course, is seen as making claims to the sovereignty that can only belong to God. They are seen as shirk, as taking gods other than the only God. And therefore, all of this must be destroyed. But sovereignty doesn't only reside in these kinds of theological characters. As early as Maududi, any claim to sovereignty, even as king or president, is also seen as sinful. Right? The nation state is also seen as taking a god other than the true God. So these things move beyond the old classical circle of what counts as theological. They move outward. So the danger posed by Shiism as a representation of the inwardness of sovereignty, where it lurks, where it takes gods other than the true God, where it creates sovereigns like the supreme leader, etc. Results in the attempt to destroy inner life altogether, I want to argue, with ISIS. So whereas in the Cold War period, you have this idea of indoctrination, where the point is where you need to, or brainwashing as it's popularly known, right? Where you need to actually take an individual or a group of people and work on them, generally by separating them from their everyday accustomed context and filling them with ideology, supposedly, right? And then they change. This requires time, it requires effort, it requires long bits of memorization and all the rest. In a few minutes I'm ending. With this form, you don't require that, because that is not the point. You don't want to create a new inner life. You want to destroy inner life. That is why we no longer speak of indoctrination, we speak of radicalization. The 7/7 Intelligence Committee report of the London bombings in 2007 note as much, that they've never seen this kind of process, the rapidity of radicalization. Right? And I suspect this is because you're not creating an ideology, you're destroying an inner life. And therefore you move from the iconic figure of Al-Qaeda, this posthumous suicide bomber whom I mentioned earlier, to another persona who no longer is posthumous. The iconic figure of ISIS is someone who will die, of course, sooner or later, but who is seen on videotapes alive, right? Enjoying himself generally, or herself, in acts of destruction, killing and the destruction of monuments. And what has been injected into this logic is if the Al Qaeda figure had to disavow sovereignty by dying through a form of sacrifice, the ISIS figure does so through pleasure and enjoyment, but by becoming purely transparent, by becoming indeed a virtual figure. That the coherence of the ISIS militant is a purely virtual coherence. In their, as it were, actual lives, they might be much messier, more complex beings who are not particularly Islamic, and we know this from the case of many such militants. The attempt then to deal with the inwardness of sovereignty, with its lair, represented best by the Shia, is to destroy that inwardness altogether. You kill the Shia and you kill everyone like them, but you also disavow that desire in yourself by transforming yourself into a purely virtual figure, where you can and you enjoy what you do. So this is a figure of pure transparency. There's no attempt to hide anything. There's no attempt to reject or deny anything. On the contrary, you want to claim every form of bloodshed and bloodthirstiness and brutality. And you do so not even in the old Al-Qaeda way by saying we regret we have to do this, but we do this because you do that, but rather by laughing and enjoying what you do. Pleasure is crucial. You must enjoy what you're doing. In a way, they are being reduced to legal subjectivity. And this is something I'm getting out of a reading of Hannah Arendt, who talks about the persona in the French Revolution, this process of ripping the mask off, the mask of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is also a crucial category with these figures. And she says, no, you must have the legal persona. You must have that to protect the inner life. Here, I think what's happening is the destruction of inner life and the maintaining only of the legal persona. These people are virtual subjects and they are only the legal subjects of Islamic law. That's it. There's nothing else there. So let me end then by quickly saying that whereas for Islamists like Maududi, Sharia or the Islamic law is meant to reconstitute the social. It's meant to be, if you will, a second nature. With Al-Qaeda, so in doing this, of course, you expel sovereignty. Right? With Al-Qaeda, there's a disavowal of sovereignty in sacrifice through this negative form of mirroring and the making of a posthumous subject. With ISIS, the law proliferates to colonize everything that is visible. Everything must be done in the name of the law. Nothing can exist without it. Even pleasure. Even pleasure must be compelled and be legalized. And therefore you must enjoy your killings and your dying. And in this way, the attempt is to create a fully transparent persona and a fully transparent society in which there is no place for the sovereign that is not God to hide. Thanks.